She thought it was just another Tuesday night shift at a cheap diner. She was wrong. When a terrified 7-year-old boy scrambled behind her counter, begging her to stay quiet, Grace didn't hesitate. She stood between a trembling child and the barrel of a loaded gun. She didn't do it for money. She didn't do it for fame. She did it because it was right. But Grace made a mistake. She thought she was saving a random runaway. She didn't realize she was protecting the only son of Vincent Russo, the most ruthless mafia boss in Chicago. And tonight, that single act of kindness is about to ignite a war. Watch closely. This is the story of how a waitress became the queen of the underworld. If this story satisfies you, smash that like button. It means everything to us. Share this video with someone who needs a good story tonight. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. The next chapter drops soon, and you won't want to miss it. The neon sign of Miller's Diner flickered in the sheet of rain pouring down, its red-orange glow washing over the window glass streaked with water. The wall clock pointed to 2:45 in the morning. Inside the diner, the air felt thick with the smell of coffee gone cold mixed with lemon cleaning solution. Rain tapped steadily on the corrugated metal roof, turning into a sad song that would not end. The place was empty, except for Mr. Henderson slumped in sleep in the back corner booth, a half-eaten slice of apple pie sitting cold in front of him. In the kitchen, Jerry the cook was scraping the grill, the steady rasp of metal on metal carrying through the room. This was the night shift, the shift for people who no longer had anywhere else to go. Grace Sullivan stood behind the counter, rubbing the back of her neck as she tried to push away the dull ache that would not let go. She was 27, but tonight she felt 50. Her white apron had yellowed and was smeared with grease from the times Jerry had spilled a pan. Her sneakers were worn down to the soles, and the big toe on her left foot was almost poking out through a ripped hole. She glanced at the tip jar on the counter. $11.40. Not enough to pay this month's electric bill, let alone the rent that was already 2 weeks late. She thought of Lily, her younger sister, in her second year of medical school in Ohio. Next term's tuition was coming due. She had promised Lily that no matter what happened, her sister would not have to drop out the way Grace had. Promises were easy. Money was hard. Grace let out a breath, reached for the mop, and decided to clean the entrance while she waited out the rest of the shift. She had just opened her mouth to call to Jerry and tell him she was going out front when the diner door flew open. Not a normal opening. It was shoved wide as if someone had slammed into it. A tiny shadow cut through the rain and crashed into Grace's leg. She staggered, nearly dropping the mop. When she looked down, she saw a boy, about 7 years old, soaked head to toe, black hair plastered to his forehead, chest heaving as he panted like he had just run a marathon. But what caught Grace's attention was not the panic on his face. It was what he was wearing. This was not ordinary kid clothing. He had on a navy blazer, the kind of expensive, soft fabric Grace had only ever seen in magazines. Even drenched and streaked with mud, she could still make out the fine stitching, the polished line of bright brass buttons. The leather shoes on his feet had to cost more than her beat-up old car. This child did not belong in this neighborhood. The boy looked up at Grace, wide brown eyes full of terror. Water rolled down his cheeks, and Grace could not tell whether it was rain or tears. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please hide me. They're coming. They hurt the driver." Grace felt her heart draw tight. The instinct of a woman, of a sister who had raised her sibling since she was 19, flared up like a fire. She did not ask the boy who he was. She did not ask what had happened. She did not reach for the phone to call the police. There was no time for any of that. She moved. Grace grabbed the boy's small, ice-cold hand and pulled him behind the counter. Beneath the soda machine was a supply cabinet, packed with syrup containers and cleaning items. Behind the cabinet was a narrow, empty space for the drain pipes. "Get in here," Grace said, her voice low but firm. "There's an opening behind it. Crawl deep into that space. No matter what you hear, you do not come out. No matter who calls, you do not answer. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes still flooded with fear. But something like trust flickered there as he looked at her. He climbed into the cabinet, making himself small among the sweet syrup containers and bottles of bleach. Grace closed the cabinet door, her heart hammering in her chest. She had barely straightened up, one hand reaching for a dish towel so she could pretend she was wiping down the counter, when the door chime rang. She turned. 2 dark figures stepped into the diner. They did not look like any late-night customers she had ever seen. Not drunks looking for shelter from the storm. Not truck drivers needing coffee for a long haul. They were hunters, and they were hunting prey. The air in the diner thickened like concrete. Grace tightened her grip on the towel, feeling her pulse pounding out of control, but her face stayed fixed in the same tired, indifferent look of a night shift waitress. The fight was about to begin. The two men walked into the diner like they owned the place. The one in front was built like a concrete pillar, shoulders so wide they nearly swallowed the doorway. A long scar cut through his left eyebrow and ran down close to his eyelid, making his face look as if someone had once tried to split it in two. But what made Grace shiver was not the scar. It was his eyes. Those eyes were empty, cold, like the eyes of dead fish laid out on a market stall. The eyes of a man who had killed and would not hesitate to kill again. The one behind him was younger, probably not yet 30, but the restless edge in his expression said he was not used to this work. His hand was shoved deep in his coat pocket, fingers moving constantly as if gripping something hard. Grace knew what it was. Both wore long black coats, the kind of expensive fabric she had only ever seen in Mafia movies. As they came closer to the counter, a scent hit Grace full in the face. Costly cologne, that sandalwood and musk kind of smell she had caught before when passing luxury shops at the mall. But under that polished fragrance was something else. Metal, gun oil, the smell of a weapon. They did not sit down. They did not look at the menu. They did not ask for coffee or pie. They walked straight to the counter and stopped right in front of Grace. Mr. Henderson was still dozing in the corner, utterly unaware. The big one spoke first, his voice rough as stones grinding together. "We're looking for a kid. A boy, black hair, about 7 years old." His father's real worried. Grace felt her heart trying to leap out of her chest, but she forced it to stay put. She had dealt with aggressive drunks, with people who skipped out on the bill, with petty thieves. She knew how to keep her face flat. She shrugged and pretended to glance around the diner with tired indifference. "Haven't seen any kid in here. It's 3 a.m. Kids are asleep in bed, not wandering the streets." Scarface curled his mouth into a smile, but the smile never reached his eyes. The dead fish eyes stayed empty and cold. "Don't play games with me, sweetheart. We saw him turn onto this block. There's nowhere else to go except this busted little diner." Grace looked him straight in the eye without blinking. "I already told you. There's no kid here. Maybe he ran down the alley out back." Scarface tilted his head, watching her the way a cat watches a mouse. Then he moved. So fast, Grace did not have time to react. A hand as big as a shovel shot out, clamped around her wrist, and twisted hard. Pain tore from her wrist up to her shoulder, and a sound slipped out of Grace before she could stop it. She fought not to scream, teeth clenched so tight she thought they might crack. "Listen carefully," Scarface growled, yanking Grace toward him until she was nearly stretched across the counter. His breath hit her face, thick with cigarettes and whiskey. "You hand the boy over. You walk away in one piece. You keep lying. I'll smash that pretty face of yours." Grace's eyes flicked toward the cabinet beneath the soda machine. All she had to do was say one word. All she had to do was nod, and the pain would stop. She could go home, keep living her ordinary life, pretend tonight had never happened. But then she thought of the boy's eyes, the terror in them as he begged her to hide him. They hurt the driver. Not a kidnapping for ransom. Not a lost child they were trying to return to his father. This was cleanup. This was silencing. If she handed him over, he would die. Grace drew in a slow breath, pain still ripping through her wrist, and she did not care. She lifted her head and stared straight into Scarface's dead fish eyes. "I already told you. I haven't seen any kid." Scarface went still for a second. Then he let out a sigh and released her wrist. Grace thought he was going to leave. She was wrong. His hand came up and slapped her hard across the face. Not the slap of an ordinary man. The strike of a professional killer. The force threw Grace backward, her back crashing into the glass pastry case. Glass exploded with a sharp clatter, and shards sliced into her arm. She hit the floor, ears ringing, her mouth flooding with the copper bite of blood. "Hey, what the hell is going on out here?" Jerry's voice rang out from the kitchen. The older cook stepped out, gripping a heavy cast-iron skillet raised like a weapon. His lined face burned with fury when he saw Grace on the floor, blood at the corner of her mouth. The younger man moved like lightning. He pulled his hand from his pocket, and in it was a glossy black Beretta, with a long suppressor fitted to the barrel. He aimed it straight at Jerry's face. "Sit down, old man. Otherwise, the next burger you flip will be in hell." Jerry froze. The skillet slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a harsh metallic crash. He backed up, both hands raised, his face drained pale as a corpse. Grace lay on the floor, blood in her mouth, staring up at the ceiling. She had just been hit for a child she did not even know, and she did not regret it. Scarface, the man Grace now knew was named Luca, from the way the younger one addressed him, turned and barked an order at his partner. "Check the back." The younger man nodded, his gun still trained on Jerry as he backed toward the kitchen door. Luca, meanwhile, began searching the front. He moved along the counter, those dead fish eyes sweeping every corner. Then he stopped in front of the row of cabinets beneath the bar. He kicked the first cabinet door hard. Bang! The door flew open, and inside there were only stacked cups and plates. He stepped to the second cabinet. Bang! Napkins and straws spilled onto the floor. Grace lay on the floor, her heart feeling as if it might burst. 3 cabinets left, 2 cabinets left. Then he would reach the cabinet beneath the soda machine, the cabinet where Nathan was hiding. She watched Luca's legs move, step by step, drawing closer. She had to do something. But what? She was just a waitress. She had no gun, no training, nothing but her bare hands and a body aching from the beating she had just taken. Desperate, Grace looked around for anything she could use. The mop, useless. The tip jar, too light. The serving tray, not enough. Then her gaze stopped behind the counter, near the kitchen where Jerry worked. The glass coffee pot. Jerry had brewed a fresh pot less than 10 minutes ago, before all of this happened. She could see steam still rising from the mouth of it, coffee boiling hot. Time seemed to slow. Grace heard Luca kicking the next cabinet as if from very far away. Bang! One more, just one more, and he would be at Nathan. She did not think anymore. She did not weigh options anymore. Survival instinct. The instinct that had carried her through her parents' deaths, through the years of fighting to raise her sister, flared up harder than ever. Grace sprang to her feet and lunged for the coffee pot. Luca heard the movement and turned at the exact wrong moment. He was too slow. Grace grabbed the pot with both hands, pivoted, and smashed it straight into Luca's head with all the strength she had. The glass struck his temple with a dull, brutal sound. The pot shattered, and the boiling coffee, hot enough to cause third-degree burns, poured down over his face, his neck, his shoulders. A scream ripped through the diner. No longer human, but the howl of a wounded wild animal. Luca staggered back, both hands clutching his face, skin blazing red and blistering beneath the scalding coffee. He slammed into a table, collapsed onto the floor, still screaming without pause. Grace did not stop. She spun to the knife rack by the kitchen and yanked out the biggest steak knife, the blade gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She raised it, her hand shaking but her voice steady. "Get out of here." The younger man swung his gun toward her, the dark muzzle of the Beretta pointed straight at Grace's chest. His finger rested on the trigger. One small squeeze and she would be dead. But Grace did not back up. She stood there, the knife in her hand, facing the barrel. She knew that if he fired, she would die before she could do anything at all. But she also knew that if she gave ground, Nathan would die. The air thickened. 1 second stretched like a century. Who would move first? Then a sound split the deadly silence. A police siren. Distant but unmistakable. Someone had called 911. Maybe Mr. Henderson, finally awake, had slipped outside. Maybe a passerby had heard the screaming. It did not matter. The siren was coming closer. The younger man and Luca looked at each other. In an instant, a decision was made. The younger man lowered the gun and stepped in to haul Luca up. Scarface was still clutching his face and groaning, skin red as boiled shrimp, parts blistered, parts weeping, but his dead fish eyes still found Grace through the gaps between his fingers. And in those eyes, she saw a promise. "I'll find you," Luca snarled, his voice warped with pain. "And when I do, you'll beg to die." The 2 dark figures pushed out the door and vanished into the rain still pounding down. The siren drew nearer and nearer. Grace stood there, the knife still in her hand, coffee and blood on the floor, her body shaking with adrenaline. She had faced killers, and she was still alive. The waitress had become a warrior. When the wail of the police siren faded into the distance and the 2 dark figures had vanished completely into the night, Grace let the knife drop. The steel blade hit the floor with a sharp metallic clatter, her hands shaking so hard she could not have held on for another second. She turned, ran to the cabinet beneath the soda machine, and yanked the door wide open. Nathan was curled up in the corner, wedged between syrup containers and bottles of bleach, his eyes huge as he looked up at her. The moment he saw Grace, he shot out like a tiny bullet and wrapped his arms around her so tight she could barely breathe. His small body trembled violently, but there was no sound of crying. Tears slid down his cheeks in silence, as if he had learned how to weep without letting anyone hear it. "You saved me," Nathan whispered into Grace's shoulder, his voice thick and breaking. "Like Mom saved me." Grace held him close, her mind racing with questions. What had his mother done? What had happened before Nathan ran into her diner? But this was not the moment to ask. She smoothed his hair, trying to soothe him. "You're safe now. It's okay. I need to call your dad. Do you know the number?" Nathan nodded, still refusing to leave Grace's arms. He recited a string of numbers, his voice trembling but clear. Grace pulled her phone from her apron pocket and dialed with fingers still smeared with blood and coffee. Her heart pounded as the ringing began. Once, twice. Then someone picked up. A man's voice came through, low and cold as ice, carrying such authority that Grace felt as if the room itself dropped a few degrees. "Where is my son?" Grace drew in a slow breath before she answered. "He's with me. I'm a waitress at Miller's on Wabash. He ran in here about half an hour ago. 2 men came looking for him. I handled them. He's safe." Silence for a beat. Then the voice changed completely. The ice cracked and melted, replaced by urgency and something that sounded like desperation. "Don't call the police. Keep him safe. I'm coming." The line went dead. Grace stared at the dark screen, wondering who she had just called. 20 minutes later, she had her answer. Engines growled outside. Not one car, but several. Grace looked through the glass and saw a convoy of sleek black vehicles pull up in front of the diner. 3 black SUVs with windows so dark she could not see inside. The kind of cars that only showed up in movies about presidents or drug lords. The middle door opened, and a man stepped out. The moment he walked into the diner, Grace understood why the voice on the phone had carried that kind of weight. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the stride of a man used to giving orders. Black hair slicked neatly back, revealing a hard, angular face that looked carved from stone. But what Grace could not look away from were his eyes. Gray, like the sky before a storm, like the sea turning violent before a hurricane. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, the kind Grace knew cost at least as much as a full year of her rent. Yet beneath that flawless surface, she saw the cracks, the dark circles under his eyes, the tension lines around his mouth. This was a man who had not slept, who had worried himself sick, who had been terrified of losing the one thing that mattered most. The aura of his power filled the tiny diner, making the air feel thick. Jerry stood frozen near the kitchen, not daring to move. Mr. Henderson, awake now, sat rigid in the corner booth, as if he feared that if he so much as breathed, the man would notice him. Then Nathan lifted his head and saw him. "Dad." The boy burst out of Grace's arms, sprinted across the diner, and ran straight into the man. And what happened next made Grace go still. The powerful man with storm eyes dropped to one knee, that knee touching the filthy floor of a cheap diner, and he wrapped his arms around the boy as if it might be the last time he ever got to. The cold wall around him collapsed completely. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Nathan's hair, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry." And then Grace saw something she never believed she would see. A tear slid down the man's cheek, then a second. Don Russo was crying. Another man stepped into the diner, big and solid, clearly a bodyguard. He moved to the man holding Nathan, and bent to murmur something into his ear. Grace could not hear the words, but she saw the effect. The man went rigid. His gray eyes darkened like a sky swallowed by storm clouds. He held Nathan tighter, as if afraid someone might snatch the boy away. The bodyguard turned to Grace and shook his head, his expression grim. She did not need anyone to explain. She understood. The driver Nathan had mentioned. A guard. And Nathan's mother, Isabella. They had not made it. A 7-year-old boy was crying in his father's arms because he had lost his mother tonight. After a long moment, the man stood, still keeping Nathan in his arms. He stepped up to Grace, those gray eyes locking onto hers. "You saved my son." Grace met his gaze without flinching, even though every instinct inside her was screaming that she should lower her head. "I only did what anyone would do." The man gave a thin smile, a smile with no warmth. "No, nobody does that. People hand the kid over to save their own skin." Something shifted in his eyes as he looked at her. Respect, curiosity, or something else Grace could not name. He gestured to his bodyguard, and the man immediately handed him a thick envelope. $50,000. "Thank you." Grace shook her head and pushed the envelope away. "I don't need money to be decent." The man studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if she had confirmed something he had suspected. "This isn't a reward," he said, his tone steady. "Those men will look for you. You saw their faces. You're a witness. You aren't safe anymore." He pulled a business card from the inside pocket of his suit and set it on the counter in front of Grace. "When you need me, and you will, call." Then he turned, carrying Nathan out the door. The black convoy surged back into the rainy night, leaving Grace standing in the wrecked diner with a business card in her hand. She looked down at it. Vincent Russo. Russo Holdings. And one question echoed in her mind. Who is Vincent Russo? That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat in her shabby studio, her back against a damp, mold-stained wall, eyes fixed on the business card in her hand. Vincent Russo, Russo Holdings. The name echoed in her mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. She knew she should let it go, should forget tonight and keep living an ordinary life. But something in her wouldn't allow it. Finally, at 4 a.m, she opened her battered old laptop and typed into the search bar, Vincent Russo, Chicago. The first results were glossy articles. Chief Executive Officer of Russo Holdings, the largest real estate and investment firm in Chicago. Photos of him at charity galas, standing beside the mayor, shaking hands with a senator. A successful businessman, a philanthropist, the most powerful man in the city. But Grace didn't stop there. She scrolled down, digging deeper, into older stories, lesser-known websites, and the truth began to emerge, piece by piece, like a gruesome picture being turned over one fragment at a time. The Russo family, a 3-generation mafia empire. Vincent's grandfather was a Sicilian immigrant who came to America in the 1930s and built an empire out of blood and gunfire. Vincent's father expanded the territory, controlling half of Chicago from gambling to smuggling. And Vincent, the 3rd generation, was called Don Russo. The boss, the ruler of the underworld. Grace closed the laptop, her hands trembling. She had just saved the son of a mafia don. She had just poured boiling coffee onto the face of an enforcer from the most notorious crime family in the city. She had just made herself a target. 2 days later, Grace tried to live as if nothing had happened. She went to work at Miller's, served coffee and pie to late-night customers, smiled at the meager tips. She went home, locked the door, tried to sleep. But she couldn't escape the feeling that someone was watching. Every time she walked down the street, she felt eyes somewhere behind her. Every time she sat in the diner, she saw a shadow slide past the glass. She told herself it was only paranoia, only the aftershock of that terrifying night. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. On Thursday afternoon, Grace got back to her apartment after a 12-hour shift. She was so tired she only wanted to fall into bed and sleep straight through to morning. But when she reached her door, she stopped. It was cracked open. The lock had been forced, bright metal scratches gleaming under the hallway light. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She pushed the door wider, and her world collapsed. The tiny studio she called home looked as if a storm had torn through it. Furniture overturned, a chair on its side, the closet yanked open, clothes scattered across the floor like corpses. The wall mirror had been smashed, glass shards glittering under the light. But what froze Grace wasn't the chaos. It was the words on the wall. Found you, written in red paint, red as blood. The letters jagged and uneven as if the writer had been trembling with excitement. Grace staggered inside, her feet crunching on broken glass, her eyes sweeping the room. Then she saw it. On the small table beside the bed, where she kept the one photograph she treasured, a picture of Lily, her little sister, beaming on her first day of college, eyes bright with hope for the future. The photo was still there, but Lily's face had been cut out with a knife. A clean, precise, cold slice. A threat that didn't need words. We know your sister. We know how to get to her. Grace sank to the floor, her knees hitting glass, but she felt no pain. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she lifted the mutilated photo and stared at the empty space where her sister's face had been. They knew about Lily. They knew who her sister was, where she was. And they wouldn't stop at threats. Grace grabbed her phone and dialed her sister's number with fingers she could barely control. She had to fight to keep her voice steady when Lily answered. Lily, listen to me. Grace cut off her sister's greeting. Stay in your dorm. Don't come home. Don't tell anyone where you are. Lily's voice came back sharp with panic. Grace, what's going on? Are you okay? Grace closed her eyes and swallowed the fear tightening around her throat. Just promise me, please. Silence for a beat, then Lily's voice softened. I promise. Grace ended the call, her hands still shaking. She sat there amid the wreckage of the apartment, looking around at what was left of the life she had fought to build for 8 years. Everything had collapsed in one night, and now they were aiming at Lily. Her eyes landed on her wallet on the floor, tossed from her purse during the search. Inside was the business card, Vincent Russo. Grace hated this, hated that she had to ask a mafia boss for help, hated that she had to step into his world, a world she knew you couldn't walk into without losing your way out. But she had no choice. The police couldn't protect her from these men. No one could. No one except the man with storm-gray eyes who had cried while holding his son in a cheap diner that night. Grace picked up the phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang once, twice, then the familiar low voice came on. Grace drew in a slow breath. Mr. Russo? I'm the waitress. I need your help. The Russo Holdings building rose in the heart of downtown Chicago like a colossal tower of glass. 40 stories thrusting straight up into a slate-gray sky. Grace stood at the main entrance, tipped her head back, and felt smaller than she ever had in her life. She wore the most respectable outfit she owned, a white button-down shirt and black jeans. Yet among the people flowing past in suits that cost thousands of dollars, she looked like someone who didn't belong. A black car had picked her up from her wrecked apartment 20 minutes earlier, with no explanation. Only a cool-faced driver opening the door and saying Mr. Russo was waiting. The moment she stepped inside the building, Grace felt as if she'd wandered into another world. The white marble floors shone so brightly she could see her own reflection in them. Antique paintings hung on the walls, the kind she'd only ever seen in museums. Security men stood everywhere in black suits, earpieces in place, their eyes sweeping over her like scanners. She was guided into a private elevator, glass and steel, with buttons the color of gold. The doors opened on the penthouse level, and Grace stepped into Vincent Russo's office. The room was as large as an entire floor of a house, glass walls revealing the whole sweep of Chicago. A heavy black oak desk planted in the center, and behind that desk, waiting as if he knew the exact second she would arrive, stood Vincent. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt with no tie, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of a business magazine. But his storm gray eyes were the same as that night, still holding something dangerous and unreadable. "I knew you'd come," Vincent said, his low voice carrying through the vast room. "My people have been watching your apartment since that night." Anger flared hot in Grace's chest. "You've been watching me?" Vincent didn't so much as blink at her outrage. "I protect the people who protected my son." Grace wanted to scream in his face, wanted to tell him she didn't need anyone's protection, that she'd taken care of herself for 8 years. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out Lily's photograph, the one with the face cut away, and laid it on the desk in front of him. "They know about my sister." Vincent looked down at the photo. His gray eyes darkened, his jaw clenched so hard Grace could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He spoke a name like a curse. "Marcus." Grace frowned. "Who is Marcus?" Vincent was quiet for a long time, as if weighing how much to give her. Then he sighed, stepped out from behind the desk, and walked to the glass wall, staring down at the city below. "Marcus Russo, my younger brother." His voice stayed even, but Grace could hear the pain hidden underneath. "He's been jealous of me since we were boys. My father chose me as the successor, not him. He's carried that hatred for 20 years. Vincent turned back to Grace, his eyes like two bottomless pits. "Marcus hired Luca and his men to kill Nathan. He thought that if my son died, I'd collapse, and he'd have his chance to steal the throne. Isabella, my wife, died because she shielded Nathan. She pushed our son away and took the bullet for him." Grace felt the blood in her body turn to ice. "Your own brother killed your wife?" Vincent let out a bitter laugh with no warmth in it. "Blood doesn't mean loyalty, Miss Sullivan. It only means they know exactly where to stab to make it hurt the most." He walked toward Grace and stopped a few steps away. "I need someone to care for Nathan. Someone he trusts. Someone brave enough to protect him. You proved you're that person." Grace stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to be a nanny for a mafia boss's son?" Vincent nodded, without a trace of embarrassment. $10,000 a month. I'll erase all your debt. $47,000 if I'm not mistaken. I'll pay your sister's full tuition and set up a private protection fund for her. You'll live in my estate, guarded 24/7. A 6-month contract. After that, you're free to leave with $500,000 in cash. Grace felt her head spin. Those numbers were bigger than anything she'd ever dared to dream, enough to change her life and Lily's forever. But this was a deal with the devil. And in return for what? She asked, her voice careful. Vincent looked at her, and for the first time Grace saw something like weakness in those storm eyes. "Give my son a woman he can trust. He hasn't spoken to anyone since his mother died. He doesn't eat. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't laugh. He's fading right in front of me and I don't know what to do. But that night, when you saved him, he spoke to you. He trusted you." Grace thought of Nathan, the terrified brown eyes in the rain, the way he'd clung to her as if she were the only lifeline in a black ocean. "You saved me, like Mom saved me." She thought of Lily, her sister who couldn't be dragged into this war. She thought of the ruined apartment, the red words on the wall, the face cut from the photograph. She didn't have a choice. "One condition," Grace said, lifting her chin and looking Vincent straight in the eye. "I'm your employee, not your property." Vincent studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can be ruthless, Miss Sullivan. But I'm not that kind of monster. Grace drew in a deep breath. Then we have a deal. She held out her hand. Vincent looked at it for a second, then took it. His hand was warm and strong, closing around her smaller one. In that moment, Grace felt as if she'd just signed in blood, as if she'd stepped through a gate into the underworld with no way back. Had she sold her soul to the devil, or was she saving herself? Only time would answer that. The black car brought Grace to the Russo estate the next afternoon. When the 10-foot iron gate began to swing open, she felt as if she were stepping into an entirely different world. The mansion rose before her like a Tuscan castle. Warm yellow stone walls, terracotta red roofs, tall dark green cypress trees lining a white gravel drive. But beneath that peaceful beauty was a fortress. Security cameras were mounted everywhere, from the gate to the roofline, sweeping every angle without missing a thing. Guards in black suits patrolled along the fence, earpieces in place, eyes sharp and alert. This wasn't a home. This was a king's territory. Grace's room was on the second floor, right next to Nathan's room at Vincent's request. When she stepped inside, she had to pause, just to breathe. This bedroom was bigger than the shabby studio she had lived in for the past 5 years. A king-sized bed with white silk sheets, a carved oak wardrobe, a private bathroom with a marble tub. The window overlooked a rose garden in full bloom. Hundreds of roses in every color pouring perfume into the air. Beautiful. Lavish. But when Grace looked out and saw 2 guards walking their rounds below, she understood. This was a gilded cage, and she was the bird who had flown into it willingly. On the first day, Grace saw Nathan again, but the boy she met in daylight was nothing like the frantic child from that rainy night. Nathan sat alone in an enormous playroom, surrounded by expensive toys any child would dream of. But he didn't play. He only sat there, eyes fixed on the window, like a small wax statue. No words, no smile, no glance for anyone. Grace walked over and knelt so she was level with him. "Hi, Nathan. Do you remember me?" Nathan didn't react. His brown eyes stayed empty, looking through her as if she didn't exist. Grace tried again. "I'm Grace. I'll be here with you." Still nothing. Nathan stood, quietly moved to another corner of the room, and turned his back on her. A maid passing by murmured to Grace. 3 nannies already gave up after a few days. He hasn't spoken to anyone since the mistress died. No one can reach him. Grace didn't give up. She knew what it felt like to lose the people you loved. She had been Nathan once, 19 years old, standing in front of 2 coffins, feeling like the world had ended. She had gone silent, had curled inward, had pushed everyone away. That first night, Grace was lying in bed when a scream tore through the darkness. "Mom! Mom, don't go!" She shot upright and ran to Nathan's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, eyes wide open but seeing nothing, his whole body shaking, sweat soaking his pajamas. A nightmare. He was reliving that horrific night, the night his mother died right in front of him. Grace didn't speak. She simply climbed onto the bed, sat beside Nathan, and pulled him into her arms. He fought her at first, trying to push her away, but she didn't let go. She held tighter, one hand stroking his back, her mouth murmuring a soft lullaby the way her mother used to when Grace was small. Slowly, Nathan stopped struggling. His little body stopped trembling. He sagged against Grace's chest, and she felt her shirt grow wet with tears. She didn't say a word. She just stayed. She just held him, until Nathan fell asleep again. In the days that followed, Grace didn't force Nathan to do anything. She didn't make him talk. She didn't make him play. She didn't make him smile. She was simply there. Every day she brought a sketchbook and crayons into Nathan's playroom, sat on the floor, and started drawing. She wasn't good at it. Her pictures were messy and awkward, but she drew anyway. Flowers, a sun, a house. Sometimes she read aloud, fairy tales about princesses and knights, about happy endings she knew real life rarely offered. Nathan didn't respond. He still sat in the corner, still silent, still staring out the window. But Grace noticed something. He no longer turned his back on her. 1 week passed, then a second. Grace stayed patient. Every night she ran to Nathan's room when he screamed from nightmares. Every day she sat on the floor and drew ugly little pictures. Then one afternoon, while Grace was drawing a cat that looked more like a ball with legs than an animal, she heard small footsteps. She didn't look up. She didn't turn around. She kept drawing, pretending she didn't know Nathan was coming closer. "Are you the coffee waitress?" A tiny voice spoke from behind her, rough from disuse, but clear and bright. Grace felt her heart about to burst with joy, but she held it in, only turning her head and offering a small smile. "Just call me Grace." Nathan stood there a few steps away, brown eyes watching her with curiosity instead of emptiness. You hit the bad man with coffee. His mouth curved, one corner, then the other. And for the first time in 2 months, Nathan Russo smiled. Grace smiled back, her eyes burning. He deserved it, didn't he? Nathan laughed louder. The sound rang through the room, spilled into the hallway, filled the mansion that had felt like a tomb for 2 months. He deserved it, the boy repeated, giggling hard. He screamed like a pig. Outside the playroom door, Tony leaned against the wall, listening to the young master's laughter. The loyal bodyguard who had followed Vincent for 20 years, who had witnessed so much death, so much blood, stood there with wet eyes. 2 months, he whispered to himself. She did it in 2 weeks. Inside the room, Grace and Nathan sat together on the floor, drawing ugly pictures and laughing like they had forgotten how. 2 wounded souls, both missing someone they loved, both lonely, had found each other in the dark. The weeks that followed brought a change no one in the Russo house had expected. Vincent started coming home earlier. Before, according to Tony, the boss used to stay at the office until midnight, sometimes not coming home for an entire week. But now, every evening at 6 o'clock, the familiar black car rolled up in front of the estate, and Vincent stepped out. His suit slightly rumpled after a long day, his stride quick as he headed inside. Dinner became a ritual. The 3 of them sat around a massive oak dining table, a table built for 20 people. But now only 3 chairs were used, clustered at one end as if they were afraid the empty space might swallow them whole. Nathan sat in the middle, Vincent on one side, Grace on the other. The chef served elaborate dishes Grace didn't know the names of, but she didn't care about the food. She cared about the way Nathan laughed while he talked about what he had learned that day, about the way Vincent listened with an attention she had never seen in any father, about the way the cold dining room slowly began to feel warmer. One evening, in the middle of dinner, Nathan slid off his chair, ran out of the room, then came back with a sheet of paper in his hand, eyes blazing. "Dad, look! Miss Grace taught me how to draw." He held the paper out to Vincent with the pride of an artist presenting a masterpiece. Grace watched and recognized the picture Nathan had drawn that morning when they sat together in the playroom. Vincent took the drawing, and Grace saw him go still. On the page were 3 crayon figures. A tall person in a black suit with a scribbled label beside it that read, "Daddy." A shorter figure with long brown hair, Grace, and a tiny person standing in the middle, Nathan. All 3 were holding hands. Vincent stared at the drawing for a long time, so long that Nathan began to worry. "You don't like it?" The boy's voice grew smaller. Grace was about to say something to break the silence, but then Vincent lifted his head and looked at her. His storm-gray eyes met her brown ones, and in that moment Grace felt the air change. Something was happening that she couldn't name, something dangerous and magnetic at the same time. "I love it," Vincent said to Nathan, his voice deeper than usual. "It's the most beautiful picture I've ever seen." Nathan squealed with joy and threw his arms around his father. But Vincent's gaze never left Grace. That night, at 11 o'clock, Grace couldn't sleep. She went downstairs for water, bare feet moving quietly over the icy marble floor. As she passed the library, she saw light spilling through the crack of a half-open door. She stopped, curious. Through the gap, she saw Vincent sitting in a leather armchair by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, eyes fixed on the flames dancing. He had taken off his suit jacket, wearing only a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his tie loosened. He looked tired. He looked lonely. Grace meant to slip away, not wanting to intrude. But Vincent's voice carried out. "Come in. Have a drink with me." Grace hesitated for a second, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The library was vast, shelves rising to the ceiling, the scent of old paper and sandalwood mixed with whiskey. She sat in the chair across from Vincent and took the glass he poured for her. For a long time they said nothing, watching the fire pulse and flicker in the hearth. Then Vincent spoke. "Tell me about you, Grace Sullivan. Why is someone like you waiting tables in a cheap diner at 3 in the morning?" Grace took a sip of whiskey, feeling the burn spread down into her chest. She didn't know why she wanted to tell him, but something about tonight, the warm firelight and the easy quiet, made her open up. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19, she said, her voice steady as if she were telling someone else's story. "A drunk driver hit them head-on the highway. They died on the spot. I was in my first year of college. Lily was 11. She paused and drew in a deep breath. I dropped out, took any job I could to raise her. Waiting tables, cashiering, cleaning offices, anything. Lily had to stay in school. Lily had to have a future. That's the only thing I've thought about for 8 years. Vincent watched her, his gray eyes no longer cold, holding something that looked like understanding. So, losing someone and still having to keep moving. Grace nodded. Then she looked at him and dared to ask what she had wanted to ask for a long time. And what about you? You lost your wife. How do you keep going? Vincent stayed silent for a long time. The fire wavered, darkness and light playing across his hard-angled face. Then he looked at her, and Grace saw something she had never seen in those storm eyes. Vulnerability, honesty. I don't keep going, Vincent said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear him. Not until now. Grace's heart began to pound harder. She didn't know how to take those words, didn't know what she was supposed to do with them. Right then, her phone vibrated in the pocket of her pajama top. She pulled it out and looked, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. A message from an unknown number. Just one short line. Enjoy it while you can. It won't last much longer. Grace killed the screen and shoved the phone back into her pocket before Vincent could see. Her heart stuttered wildly. Marcus was still watching. Marcus was still waiting. But she didn't want to shatter this moment, didn't want to drag darkness into a warm room. She lifted her head, forcing calm into her face. Something wrong? Vincent asked, his sharp eyes sweeping over her. Nothing. Grace shook her head and made herself smile. Just spam. Vincent looked at her for a moment like he didn't believe her, but he didn't press. Instead, he raised his whiskey glass, his gaze still locked on her. You're not like anyone I've ever met, Grace Sullivan. Grace felt heat climb into her cheeks under that look. Was it a compliment or a warning? Vincent smiled. For the first time, she saw him truly smile. Not a cold smile or a bitter one, but a smile that lit up his hard face, softened the rigid lines. Both. The air between them shifted. Grace could feel it, the dangerous pull drawing her toward the man across from her. She knew she should stop. She knew this was a road with no turning back. But with the fire crackling and gray eyes looking at her as if she were the most precious thing on earth, Grace Sullivan didn't want to stop. Two broken people had found each other in the dark, and beyond the library door, in the cold night, the threat still hung there, waiting. 2 weeks after that night in the library, the Russo estate was livelier than it had ever been. Staff hurried back and forth, preparing fresh flowers, decorative lights. A long banquet table laid out in elaborate detail in the grand hall. Today was Mrs. Russo's 70th birthday, and by family tradition, this was an event no one could miss. Grace was told she would attend with Nathan. When she started to put on the only simple black dress she owned, a maid knocked on her door and handed her a large box. Inside was a deep blue evening gown, silk so soft it felt like water sliding through her fingers, along with a pair of high heels and a set of pearl jewelry. There was no note, but Grace knew who had sent it. When she walked down the staircase with Nathan holding her hand, she felt Vincent's gaze from below in the grand hall. He was greeting guests, but his gray eyes paused on her for 1 second longer than necessary. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she forced herself to look calm. The guest list was packed, a sea of unfamiliar faces, yet Grace could guess exactly who they were. Men in expensive suits with razor-sharp eyes were high-level mafia. The ones smiling and shaking Vincent's hand were politicians. The ones trading polished laughter over wine were business owners. This was Vincent's world, a world of power and money. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt like she belonged. She was standing with Nathan near the banquet table when a voice sounded behind her. Well, look who it is, the famous waitress. My brother talks about you a lot. Grace turned and found herself facing a man. He was a few years younger than Vincent, maybe 33 or 34, with sleek black hair and a movie star handsome face. He was more classically beautiful than Vincent, with an easy, charming smile and the smooth confidence of a man who knew how to draw people in. But the instant their eyes met, a chill ran straight down Grace's spine. That smile never reached his eyes. Behind the friendly surface, those eyes were empty, exactly like Luca's had been on that rainy night. The eyes of a killer. I'm Marcus, Vincent's brother. He held out his hand, the smile still in place. Grace shook it, and it felt like touching a snake. Marcus's hand was cool and dry, and he held on a little longer than he needed to. Grace pulled Nathan closer to her side, her protective instincts rising hard. It's nice to meet you, she said, her voice calm, her eyes never leaving Marcus. Oh, don't be so formal, Marcus chuckled, then crouched to Nathan's level. And here's my beloved nephew. I brought you a present. He produced a large box from behind his back, and inside was an expensive remote-controlled robot, the kind Grace knew had to cost at least a few $100s. Nathan's eyes went wide, delight lighting up his small face. "Thank you, Uncle Marcus." Marcus smiled and began telling funny stories. Stories about Vincent when he was little, about the mischief the two brothers used to get into. Nathan giggled, his guard dropping for a moment. Grace watched, trying to find a crack in Marcus's perfect mask. But he played the role of the kind uncle flawlessly. Then Marcus stood and pulled Nathan into his arms. An embrace that looked affectionate, but Grace caught the shift immediately. Nathan went rigid in Marcus's hold. The smile vanished from the boy's mouth. His brown eyes widened with the same fear Grace had seen on that rainy night. A child's instincts were sharper than an adult's. Nathan sensed something wrong that others couldn't see. Marcus released him, patted Nathan's head, and rose to his feet. "You're a good boy. I'll see you again soon." He smiled at Grace, dipped his head in farewell, then walked away and disappeared into the crowd. But before he vanished completely, he looked back at her one more time, and in that instant the smile was gone. Only a gaze cold as a blade remained. After the party, when the two of them returned to their rooms, Nathan clutched Grace's hand and whispered, "Miss Grace, I don't like Uncle Marcus." Grace knelt and looked into the boy's eyes. "Why, sweetheart?" "His eyes are wrong," Nathan said, his voice so small Grace had to lean in to hear. Like the bad man's eyes that night. Grace pulled him close, her heart tightening. "You're very smart," she whispered. "Stay away from him. If he comes near you, you find me or your dad right away. Do you understand?" Nathan nodded, his expression solemn. Far down the hallway, a figure stood watching. Marcus watched Grace and Nathan whispering, the charming smile gone completely. In its place was the cold, calculating face of a predator. That night, Vincent summoned Grace to his private office. He stood behind his desk, his expression grave. "Marcus asked about you," Vincent said, his voice low. "He wants to know why you're here, why you matter so much." Grace drew in a slow breath. "I think he knows I suspect him." Vincent studied her for a long moment, gray eyes heavy with concern. "Never leave Nathan alone with him," he said, his voice like an order. "Never. And if anything feels off, even something small, you call me immediately." Grace nodded. She understood. The snake had shown its face, and the hidden war had officially begun. After Mrs. Russo's birthday party, something shifted between Vincent and Grace. Not in a good way. It was a quiet tension, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Anytime they ended up in the same room by accident, the air turned heavy, almost suffocating. Once, when Grace took Nathan down for breakfast, her hand brushed Vincent's as they both reached for the milk pitcher. It felt like an electric shock through the skin, and they both jerked back as if they had touched fire. Their eyes met, gray to brown, and for a long-stretched moment they both forgot how to breathe. Then they both turned away, pretending nothing had happened. After that day, Vincent began avoiding Grace. He no longer came home at 6 o'clock to eat dinner with Nathan. He came in late, after the boy was asleep, and left early, before the sun rose. The dinners of 3 around the massive table became only 2, Grace and Nathan, sitting in a silence that felt like a weight. Grace was confused. She didn't understand what was happening, or more truthfully, she didn't want to admit what she was feeling. Was she falling in love with a mafia boss? Was she walking into the devil's trap she had stepped into willingly? Nathan was the first to notice. One evening, while Grace was feeding him, Nathan set down his chopsticks and looked at her with eyes older than his years. "Why doesn't Dad eat with us anymore?" Grace tried to smile, but the smile never reached her eyes. "Dad's busy with work, sweetheart." Nathan tilted his head, watching her like he could see straight through the mask she was wearing. "Did Dad and Miss Grace fight?" Grace didn't know how to answer. A 7-year-old could see what adults tried to hide, could feel the change no one spoke out loud. But the fragile peace was shattered late one evening by an unexpected crisis. At 2 a.m, Grace was jolted awake by a pained crying coming from Nathan's room. She ran in, and her heart dropped when her hand touched his forehead, hot as fire. She found the thermometer, slid it under Nathan's arm, and the number that appeared sent panic rushing through her. 103.1 degrees. Grace called the Russo family's private doctor, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. While she waited, she pressed cold cloths to Nathan's forehead, gave him fever medicine, wiped away the sweat pouring off his small body like water. Nathan drifted in and out, lips moving as he called for his mother, and every time he said it, it felt like a blade slicing through Grace's chest. The doctor arrived, examined him, and said it was a common viral fever, that they needed to watch him through the night. Then he left, leaving Grace alone with a boy burning with fever. 3 a.m, 4 a.m, the fever still wouldn't break. Grace sat beside Nathan's bed, her hand never stopping as she cooled him, her voice barely above a whisper as she sang lullabies her mother used to sing to her. She didn't dare sleep. She didn't dare take her eyes off Nathan for even a second. She prayed to anyone who might be listening, begged them not to take this boy away. She couldn't lose Nathan. She couldn't lose anyone else. At 5 a.m, hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway. The bedroom door flew open, and Vincent rushed in, suit wrinkled, tie loosened, face pale with fear. He had just gotten home from an emergency meeting with a partner, and Tony had told him Nathan had a high fever. He ran upstairs without even changing. When he saw Grace, Vincent stopped for a second. She was sitting beside his son's bed, dark circles under her eyes, hair a mess, her pajama top damp with sweat from a night of tending Nathan. She looked like she might collapse, but she was still there, not gone for even a second. Vincent sat down on the other side of the bed and took his son's hand. The two of them kept watch in silence through what was left of the night. At 6 a.m, when the first light of dawn slipped through the curtains, Nathan began to sweat. The fever broke. The boy sank into a peaceful sleep, breathing steady, his small face no longer flushed with heat. Grace let out a long breath, and that was when her body betrayed her. She rose unsteadily, legs weak, her head spinning with exhaustion. She started to fall, and strong arms caught her. Vincent held her upright, and he didn't let go. They were too close, close enough that Grace could feel his breath on her lips, could see the rough shadow on his jaw from a sleepless night, could catch tiny flecks of gold hidden in his storm-gray eyes. "You treat Nathan like he's your own," Vincent said, his voice raw. Grace looked at him without flinching. "Because I love him. Is that wrong?" Vincent stayed quiet for a long time, his gray eyes locked on her face. Then something in that gaze shifted, the coldness melted, replaced by something soft and dangerous. "You turned this house into a family," he whispered, his voice like wind. Then he kissed her, gently, like he was afraid she would break if he was any rougher. His lips were warm and soft, tasting of whiskey and cigarettes, tasting of a long night without sleep. Grace knew she should push him away. She knew this was madness, that it was wrong, that it was a road with no turning back. But she couldn't stop. She kissed him back, her hands gripping his shirt like it was the only lifeline in a storm. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Vincent rested his forehead against hers, eyes squeezed shut. "I shouldn't," he began. But Grace lifted a finger to his mouth and stopped him. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't apologize for this." Vincent opened his eyes to look at her, and in that gray gaze, Grace saw what she had never seen before. Vulnerability, hunger, the loneliness of a man who had locked his heart away for 2 years, now letting someone step inside again. He pulled her into his arms, holding tight like he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. For the first time in 2 years, Vincent Russo let someone close to his heart. And Grace Sullivan knew, standing in the arms of a mafia boss in the dawnlight, that she had crossed the point of no return. 3 days after that kiss, the Russo estate sank into a peace that felt terrifying. Vincent and Grace tried to keep their distance in front of the staff and the guards, acting as if nothing had changed between them. But every night, once the entire estate had fallen asleep, they met on the balcony behind the library. They talked late into the night, about the past, about the present, about the things they did not dare to say in daylight. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the Chicago night sky. Nathan was happier than he had ever been. He laughed more, talked more, and he started calling Grace by a name she never dared to dream of, Mom Grace. The safety they had built was violently uprooted in the dead of night. It was exactly 2 a.m. when Grace's world was suddenly plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The bedside lamp died. The digital clock on the nightstand went dark. Not a single thread of light slipped under the door. She jolted upright, her heart slamming. This was not a normal power outage. The Russo estate had backup generators that could kick in within 3 seconds if the main power failed. But 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30, and there was still only darkness. Someone had hacked the security system. Someone had disabled the entire estate. Silence pressed down. Silence so complete Grace could hear her own heartbeat. Then the silence was torn apart. Bang, 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 bang. Gunshots erupted from downstairs, followed by glass shattering, screams, the thunder of running feet. Grace did not think. She leapt out of bed and ran barefoot through the pitch-black hallway toward Nathan's room. She slammed into a wall, clipped the doorframe, but she didn't stop. Nathan. She had to get to Nathan. She shoved open his door, and in the faint light from the window she saw Nathan sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror. "Miss Grace." "What's happening?" Grace rushed in and pulled him into her arms. "We have to go now." She scooped Nathan up, and the boy wrapped his legs around her waist like a koala clinging to its mother. Grace ran back into the hallway, her heart pounding like a war drum, her ears straining for every sound. Gunfire still cracked from downstairs, braided with shouting and the crash of breaking things. Muzzle flashes flared now and then from the stairwell, throwing chaotic moving shadows up the walls. Grace turned into the east corridor, where Vincent had shown her the safe room for emergencies. She had to get Nathan there. She had to. A figure appeared in front of her. Grace almost screamed, then realized it was Tony. The loyal bodyguard stood blocking the corridor, a gun in his hand, his face tight with strain. "Miss Sullivan, get Nathan to the safe room now." Tony shouted over the noise. "I'll hold them here. Go." Grace nodded and ran. She had barely rounded the corner when a gunshot sounded right behind her. Bang! Tony's cry of pain. Grace spun back, and her heart felt like it was being crushed in a fist. Tony lay on the floor, blood spreading red beneath his chest, his hand still trying to raise the gun but no longer strong enough. A dark figure stood over him, the gun barrel still smoking. "Run!" Tony roared with the last of his strength. Grace swallowed her tears and ran. She did not dare look back. She held Nathan tight, pressed a hand over his ear so he would not hear the final shot that ended Tony behind them. The safe room was at the end of the corridor. Grace reached it, set Nathan down, and punched in the code Vincent had given her on the keypad beside the steel door. The small screen flashed red. "Access denied." Grace tried again, certain she had not misentered it. "ACCESS denied." The blood in her veins turned to ice. Someone had changed the code. Someone inside the estate had changed the code. There was a traitor. There was no way out. Grace stood there with her back to the steel door she could not open. Arms wrapped around Nathan as he trembled. She looked around wildly for an exit, a hiding place, anything. But the corridor was a dead end. No other doors. No windows. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the hallway. Slow. Confident. Like whoever was coming knew the prey had nowhere left to run. Grace shoved Nathan behind her, pressed him flat to the wall. She stood in front of him, arms spread like a shield. Even though she knew she had nothing to stop the person walking toward them, the figure stepped out of the darkness. Marcus Russo stood there, 10 paces away. The gun in his hand was still smoking. His white shirt was smeared with blood, the blood of the guards he had killed on his way in. And on his mouth was a smile, the unhinged smile of a man who had finally gotten what he wanted. "Hello there, little waitress," Marcus said, his voice gentle as if he were greeting an old friend. "We meet again." Grace shoved Nathan behind her, using her own body as a shield. She knew it was pointless, knew she couldn't fight a man with a gun using only bare hands, but she had no other choice. She would die before she let anyone lay a hand on Nathan. Marcus came closer, 2 of his guards following behind him with rifles in their hands. The smile on his mouth widened as he took in the scene. "The nanny in the air?" he sneered. "How touching." Grace swallowed her fear and forced her voice to stay steady. "Let the boy go. He's just a child." Marcus tilted his head, looking at her as if she had said something funny. "Nathan is the whole point of this, little waitress. Without an heir, Vincent will fall apart, and when my brother falls apart, I'll become the next Don." That was the plan from the start. Killing a 7-year-old to steal a throne? Grace couldn't keep the disgust out of her voice. "You killed your own sister-in-law. You killed Isabella." Marcus shrugged, indifferent, like he was talking about the weather. "Isabella was collateral. She stepped in front of the kid, so she had to die. Just like you now." Behind Grace, Nathan trembled but didn't cry. He had seen his mother die, had witnessed more violence than any child ever should. He knew this fear. He had learned how to face it. He whispered into Grace's back, so softly she had to strain to hear, "Don't let him hurt you again." Grace tightened her grip on Nathan's hand behind her without turning around. "I won't, I promise." While Marcus kept talking, savoring his moment of power, Grace's eyes swept the hallway in silence. She needed a weapon. She needed a chance. Anything. Then she saw it. On a wooden shelf 3 steps away, an antique ceramic vase sat motionless, heavy enough to do damage. She measured the positions of the 2 guards. One stood closer, right beside the shelf. The other stood farther away, near the stairs. Marcus was still talking, drunk on his own scheme, explaining how long he had planned this, how he had waited for this moment. He was distracted. This was it. Grace moved. She lunged for the vase. 3 steps that felt like 3 light years. Her hand closed around it. She spun, and she hurled it straight into the face of the nearest guard with everything she had. The vase slammed into his face with a dry crack. Ceramic shattered. Blood burst from his nose, and he stumbled back. His finger jerked on the trigger and his rifle went off, the shot blasting into the ceiling with a deafening boom. Without hesitation, Grace charged Marcus. She didn't know how to fight. She had never trained, never thrown punches in her life, but she was fighting for Nathan's life. She clawed at Marcus's face, her nails digging deep into his skin. She bit his hand when he tried to shove her off. She punched and kicked and screamed like a wild animal protecting its young. But Marcus was stronger. He drove a fist into Grace's stomach, a blow so hard she doubled over, unable to breathe. Before she could recover, he smashed the butt of his gun into her temple. The world exploded into a million shards of light. Grace hit the floor, blood spilling into her eye, her head spinning like she was trapped on a violent carousel. She tried to crawl up, tried to stand, but her body wouldn't listen. Her limbs felt boneless, soft and useless. She had no strength left. Marcus stood over her, panting, his face torn with scratches from her nails. Blood streaked down his cheek, but he was still smiling, the unhinged smile of a winner. "You annoying little bitch," he snarled, lifting his gun and aiming it straight at Grace's chest. "You could have handed the kid over and walked away in one piece. But no, you had to play hero. Now you die too." "No!" Nathan's voice ripped through the air. "Let her go." Grace tried to turn her head, tried to shout for Nathan to run, but her throat locked, and only a rasp came out. "Run, sweetheart. Run." Nathan didn't run. Marcus laughed, the gun still pointed at Grace, his eyes sliding to the boy. "Your turn next, nephew. Give me a second." Grace closed her eyes. She had failed. She hadn't protected Nathan. She was going to die, and then Nathan would die, and it would all be her fault. She waited for the shot that would end her. Bang! The gunshot cracked through the narrow corridor, deafening. But the pain didn't come. Grace opened her eyes. Marcus was still standing there, but something was wrong. The smile was gone from his mouth. In its place was shock, disbelief. He looked down at his chest, where a red flower was blooming on his white shirt. Blood. Oh. Marcus breathed a single sound, and then his knees buckled. He went down like a felled tree, the gun flying from his hand, his eyes still open as he stared up at the ceiling. Behind Marcus's body, Nathan stood there, a 7-year-old boy holding the fallen guard's gun, the weapon nearly half his size. The recoil had thrown him into the wall, his back slamming hard into the marble. But he had pulled the trigger, and the bullet had found its mark. I shot the bad guy," Nathan said, his voice trembling, eyes still wide as he stared at Marcus's body. Like Miss Grace hit the bad guy with coffee. Grace didn't know where the strength came from, but she crawled to Nathan. She yanked the gun from his hands and threw it as far away as she could. Then she pulled him into her arms, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. She turned him, blocking his eyes from Marcus's body on the floor. "You saved us," she sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks, mixing with the blood from her head wound. "You saved us, sweetheart. You were so brave." Nathan shook in her arms, and then his small body began to cry. "Like Mom saved me," he sobbed. "Like Mom." Grace held tighter, rocking him like an infant. She couldn't speak anymore. She only cried, crying with relief, crying with fear, crying because the 7-year-old boy in her arms had just had to kill someone to save her. A 7-year-old had done what adults couldn't. He had protected the person he loved. Footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor, fast and urgent, nothing like Marcus's slow, confident approach before. Grace lifted her head, her heart still racing, her arms still locked around Nathan. Then she saw him. Vincent burst into the hallway like a storm. His white shirt was stained red with blood from a wound along his side, but he didn't slow down. A gun was in his hand, and his eyes were wild as they swept the chaos, searching. Then he saw what was in front of him. Marcus lay dead on the floor, blood spreading into a dark pool under the blinking emergency lights. Marcus's 2 guards were motionless too, and in the corner of the corridor, Grace and Nathan were clinging to each other, both of them covered in blood, both of them crying. Vincent let the gun fall. The metal struck the marble with a sound like a bell in the silence. He dropped to his knees, crawled to them, and pulled them both into his arms. He thought he had lost them. "I thought I lost you both," Vincent whispered into Grace's hair, his voice breaking. "I thought I lost you both." Don Russo, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, the man no one dared to anger, the man people said had no heart, was crying. Tears slid down his hard, angular face, and fell into Grace's tangled hair. He held them as if the moment he let go, they would vanish. The first light of dawn began to spill through broken windows, casting pale gold beams into the shattered estate. Looking around, Grace saw the destruction of the night before. Walls pocked with bullet holes like honeycomb, glass scattered across the floor, glittering like fake diamonds in the dawn. Furniture smashed, paintings fallen from the walls, marble stairs stained with blood. But the storm had passed. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Vincent's legal team, the men paid millions of dollars a year for situations exactly like this, arrived before the police did. They took control of the scene, arranged the story, prepared statements. The official version would be a home invasion, a gang attack on the estate, the family acting in self-defense. No one would mention Marcus. No one would mention the war for power inside the Russo family. Money changed everything. Evidence vanished. History was rewritten. Grace sat in the back of an ambulance parked at the estate gates. A silver blanket wrapped around her shoulders for warmth. A medic was stitching the wound at her temple, where Marcus had struck her with the gun. She didn't feel pain. She didn't feel anything. Only emptiness and exhaustion after the storm. She stared out and saw black body bags being wheeled out of the mansion on gurneys. Marcus, his guards, Tony. She closed her eyes when she thought of Tony, the man who had died to buy her time to run. A dark chapter had ended, but the price was too high. Familiar footsteps approached. Grace opened her eyes and saw Vincent standing in front of her. His hand was bandaged. The wound on his side had been treated, but his face was still pale from blood loss. In his hand was a check. "The contract is complete," Vincent said, his voice low and exhausted. "You saved my son twice. You're free now. You can go anywhere. No one will threaten you again." He held the check out to her. Grace looked down at the number written there. $5 million. She took it, feeling its weight in her hand. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Enough to buy a beautiful home for her and Lily. Enough for Lily to finish school without ever worrying about money again. Enough for Grace to live a normal, quiet life. No mafia, no guns, no blood. She could go to Florence like she had dreamed. She could start over. But Grace looked up at the ruined estate behind Vincent. She thought of Nathan, sleeping in a temporary room off the living area after the doctor gave him a mild sedative. He would wake up and need someone there. He would have nightmares about tonight and need someone to hold him. She thought of Vincent, the lonely king of the underworld, the man who had locked his heart away for 2 years and finally let someone step inside. She thought of herself. She wasn't Grace Sullivan anymore, the exhausted waitress with $11 in tips in her pocket. She had changed. She had fought. She had survived. She had found a family in the last place she ever expected. Grace held the check in her hand. Then slowly, she tore it. Into pieces. The scraps fluttered in the morning wind like white snowflakes, carrying her old life away with them. Vincent stood there, eyes wide with shock. "Grace, why?" Grace rose, stepped down from the ambulance, and faced him. "I don't want to go to Florence alone," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "And I don't want to leave Nathan. He needs me." Vincent looked at her for a long time, storm-gray eyes holding 1,000 unspoken emotions. "And what about me?" he asked, his voice rough. "Do I need you?" Grace smiled, her first smile after a long, horrific night. "You tell me, boss." Vincent stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He lifted a hand and brushed her cheek, his fingers trembling as if he was afraid she would disappear if he touched too hard. "You're the only person who ever made me kneel," he whispered. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding tight as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Grace rested her head against his chest and listened to his heart beating hard beneath the blood-stained shirt. "Just don't make me cook," she said, her voice thick with tears and a laugh. "I'm sick of diners." Vincent laughed, a real laugh, deep in his chest, warm and alive. It was the first time she had heard him laugh like that. All right, amid the ruins of the estate, among the bodies and dried blood, under the dawn of a new day, Grace Sullivan made her choice. She chose love over safety. She chose family over freedom. She chose to stay. 1 year later, the Russo estate had been rebuilt from the rubble. Not just rebuilt, but made more beautiful, stronger, like a symbol of rebirth from ashes. The new walls were painted a pure white beneath brilliant golden sunlight. The rose garden behind the mansion was in full bloom with hundreds of roses in every color, their rich fragrance drifting through the air. And today, in the heart of that rose garden, a wedding was taking place. Grace stood beneath an arch of white flowers, a pristine white silk wedding gown hugging her body as if it had been sewn for this exact moment. She looked radiant and powerful, her brown eyes shining with happiness. There was no trace left of the exhausted waitress from years ago, with worn-out shoes and $11 in tips in her pocket. She had transformed, not only on the outside but from within. She had become the woman she had always had the potential to be, only life had never given her the chance before. Vincent stood beside her in a perfectly tailored black suit, but his storm-gray eyes looked only at her. He looked at her as if she were the entire universe, as if she were the sun and he was only a planet circling her. The most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, the man who made the whole city tremble, now stood there with the eyes of someone madly in love. Nathan stood beside his father as the ring-bearer, wearing a tiny black suit and holding a red velvet pillow with 2 wedding rings. He was grinning, the grin of a child who was loved and protected. The ghost of nightmares had faded, replaced by the confidence and joy every child deserves. Across from them, Lily stood as a bridesmaid in a pastel pink dress, eyes red with emotion. The medical student now knew everything about her sister's life, about the underworld, about what Grace had endured to protect her. And she was still here, loving her sister more than ever. "You deserve to be happy, Grace," Lily whispered. "All of this." Grace held her sister, tears rolling down her face. "Both of us deserve it." Guests filled the neat rows of white chairs set on the green lawn. Not only mafia bosses in expensive suits, but also politicians, judges, and Chicago's elite. They all knew the story of the woman in the wedding dress. They knew she was the waitress who had stood in front of a gun to protect a child she didn't even know. They knew she had fought killers with nothing but a coffee pot and courage. And they knew better than to treat her lightly. She wasn't only Vincent Russo's wife. She was the Queen of Chicago. Vincent took Grace's hand and looked deep into her eyes. "You're the only good thing I never deserved," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Grace smiled, a smile meant only for him. "Lucky for you. I don't care whether you deserve me or not." They kissed beneath the white flower arch, to the applause and cheers of the guests. The kiss was a promise, a vow, the beginning of a new chapter. "Group hug," Nathan cut in, squeezing between them, his small arms trying to wrap around both his new dad and mom. Grace and Vincent laughed and bent down to gather him in. The 3 of them stood there, holding each other in the blooming rose garden. A family, built from ruins, bound together by love and sacrifice. Rain brought her the storm, but the storm also brought her a kingdom. Grace did not only save a little boy, she saved an entire family, and she found a love worth fighting for. Sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful destinations. This story teaches us that kindness is never meaningless, that one brave act can change a whole life, that family is not only the people who share your blood, but also the people willing to fight for you. Grace proved that where you come from does not decide your fate, and true love can bloom in places no one expects. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love, the people who might need a beautiful story to keep believing in love and kindness. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more moving stories every day. How do you feel about Grace and Vincent's story? In real life, do you believe one small act of kindness can change destiny? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. Wishing you and your family good health, a life full of joy and happiness. See you again in the next video.